Hello, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited about our discussion today about war crimes in cannabis, or the war on drugs, and the history of that, your personal experiences and insight about what that really looks like from, an experiential level, and what it means for the industry currently, what it means for the industry moving forward, what can be done about, especially to kind of make up for what's happened in the past. Just for a little background on me, I'm a cannabis business consultant in the industry for the past 6 years. So I work with a lot of investors to get them into the industry, to operate their businesses and to grow them. And so I'm really excited to see what your perspective is on everything, because I probably have kind of a limited one on this topic, but I have a lot of personal interest in it. I would love to start with just a background on each one of you, what you're doing now, kind of, who you are, and just to get a basis there, and then we can move into the background of this whole topic and then move from that point. If Frederika, if you would start off, that'd be great.
Sure. So, hey everyone, I'm Frederika Easley. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the People's Ecosystem. And so primarily what I do is I analyze legislation, regulation, rules with a lens of equity. And so I'm looking for areas where language can be strengthened and or where something that we call repurposing harm, but where that is a possibility, where it can occur, whether it's intentional or not. Background, I am originally from Buffalo, New York, so basically Canada, but still a New Yorker at heart. I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm a mother, I'm a certified yoga instructor. I'm just really all about wellness, right? And making sure that we're shifting power dynamics in whatever way we can, specifically for BIPOC and women in this industry and beyond.
Much appreciated. Marie?
Hello, thank you so much, Juliana. Marie Montmarquet. I am an owner and cannabis operator and advocate based out of San Francisco, California. My brother and I oversee a vertically operated business with 50,000 square feet of cultivation in Salinas, California. We have distribution, processing, nursery, oversee as well delivery service. We've been in the legacy market throughout the 2015 through the beginning of 2018, and we transitioned all of our businesses into Prop 215. I'm an equity advisor for Success Centers, a nonprofit in San Francisco, where I help a lot of the equity applicants go through the permitting, post-operational phases in San Francisco for distribution, manufacturing, delivery, and retail. So I've been seeing, of course, gone through myself a lot of the different struggles trying to transition. I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, and knew that I wanted to be in cannabis and stay out of jail. So I had to move to California. I moved out here in 2010 to get involved in the regulated market and the compliant market. So it's been an interesting transition over the last 12 years.
Thank you. I love the transition experience. That's a fascinating one. Erik, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Erik Range, and I serve as the board chair for Minorities for Medical Marijuana. I also wear a number of hats in the space. I do some consulting work for folks during application phases, as well as group coaching for entrepreneurs in the hemp CBD space. And my company, Hemp and Fork, is the first Black-owned hemp food manufacturer in the country. So, we operate in a few different roles, but my primary role is as the board chair for Minorities for Medical Marijuana. We're the largest minority 501c3 national nonprofit with chapters in 27 states around the country and a few international chapters as well in Canada, Jamaica, and London. And we focus very holistically on this industry. We start with public policy, of course, but we do a lot of educating for our communities, educating for the different stakeholders throughout the various throughout the industry and the supply chain, helping to connect minority business owners and suppliers with cannabis operators, doing what we can to make sure that no stone is left unturned, and that we're considering everything from research on down to how my grandmother is going to benefit from this medicinally. So we're very involved. We're a boots on the ground organization, and we, like I said, several chapters throughout the country, just working to make sure that minorities are not an afterthought in this space, but that as we are bringing this industry online across the country, that we are at the very forefront of the thought process, and that we're approaching it very specifically with a lens of social equity and social economics to right the wrongs of the war on drugs and prohibition. So this industry in particular has a distinct opportunity to become the most diverse industry across the country, but only if we choose to realize that, and that we're intentional about the things that we do in the way that we set up these programs as well.
Thank you for that. And Niambe, am I saying that correctly, by the way?
It's Niambe, so you're pretty.
Niambe, okay. Thank you.
No problem. My name is Niambe McIntosh, also Niambe Tosh. I'm the daughter of the reggae icon Peter Tosh. I am head of his legacy and brand, and in that capacity, I founded the Peter Tosh Foundation, which is geared at fulfilling his mission to promote equal rights and justice. He also wrote the legendary song and the anthem for the legalization movement called Legalize It. And so through one of our initiatives, Legalize It, we actually work pretty closely with Minorities for Medical Marijuana. So Erik is definitely a brother of mine, and we work together to fulfill the mission and the initiatives of Minorities for Medical Marijuana. I'm also an activist in the cannabis space, sharing how my family has been personally impacted by the war on drugs, and we can definitely get into that a little bit further. I've spent many of my years as an educator in Boston public schools, particularly in special education and math, and born in Jamaica, raised in Boston, and in the space also as an entrepreneur as well. So we all wear many hats, and I'm joining the club of many hat holders.
Thank you. So it's like, I love the family mission, the long-term family mission standing there. I'd love to start out with just a basis for people on what the history, at least what are the, it'd be hard to go over the whole history, but what are the key pieces that people should know in terms of what the history of the war on drugs has been, especially in reference to cannabis, what those key pieces have been and what those key impacts have been on communities that have been most impacted. Does that make sense what I'm going for? Okay, great. Who would like to start with that? Anyone?
Well, I guess I'll start, and we probably will all piggyback off of each other. But I think a key thing to note here is that the war on drugs was intentional. The groups of people who were specifically targeted, all of that was intentional. Oftentimes you will hear the war on drugs referred to as a failure, but it wasn't a failure. It was successful. What they set out to do, they were able to do that. And so, you had Black and Latinx and Indigenous people who intentionally were squashed, whose communities were decimated, resources were pillaged, families were broken apart. And so there was an intentionality with this. They went beyond, they ignored the science, right? Like, they ignored the studies that were done by professionals at the time who said, hey, cannabis, this plant, it is medicinal. It is our, ancestral right. People have been using it for centuries. If you look at religious texts and things of that nature, you will see references or read references in terms of the burning bush, in terms of ceremonial practices that include this plant. And they ignored all of that, right? Because that didn't fit with the narrative. That didn't fit with what they wanted to do at the time. And so what they wanted to do was find a way to demonize jazz musicians. What they wanted to do was find a way to demonize, those flower power people. And they wanted to find a way to demonize Latinx individuals who may have been coming over from Mexico or other areas, other countries, right? So that's what they wanted to do. And they were successful at doing it over 50 years of prohibition. And, our inner cities, our families are still dealing with trauma. And it's ongoing, right? Because there are still people serving time. There's still Black and Latinx men, women, Indigenous men and women who are still serving time for a plant that is regulated in the majority of the states, whether it's medical and or adult use. And people are making money. And unfortunately, 90% of business owners are white men, right? So it was very intentional and it was very successful. And I'll stop there and pass it on.
Frederika, I think you were spot on. One of the things I often like to talk about, and I think we'll get more into it later in this discussion, the war on drugs was extremely pervasive, and it went into every aspect of living. And so when we think about how do you correct that, we can't just stop at licensing. But again, I'll save that point for later. But what I like to try to jog people's memory, we talk about, like, right now we're in the legalization era, if you will. But prior to that, we were in prohibition, right? The war on drugs. But most people don't even think about or talk about what happened prior to that, with pre prohibition. And during that time, our federal government paid farmers to grow this plant. During war times, we as a country invested in this plant. Okay, this was used in medicine for decades, about healing. It was a part of what your average physician would learn about when they went to medical school. This all was in place prior to 1937, when we decided that we were going to outlaw this and make it. We were going to not call it cannabis. We were not going to call it hemp. We were going to call it marijuana. Make a racially derogatory term to associate it with it. Again, like Frederika said, to be able to bring in certain communities and demonize those communities and link usage to those communities. One of the things that I think that we oftentimes forget is, if all we did in 1937 was pass a law and make it illegal, then all we would need to do now in 2022 is pass a law and make it legal. But it was the war on drugs. It was the pervasiveness of that really and truly led us to what we are seeing now, and the conditions we see in communities. The fact that Black and brown men have been ripped away from their families and incarcerated and institutionalized. That is all the effect of the war on drugs. And so, it wasn't in just 1937. When we got to the 70s, we doubled down on it. And Congress passed the, it's escaping me now. Congress passed a law that, set into place mandatory minimums and all of these other things that we now heard about that were associated with the war on drugs and being tough on crime and all of these things. These things are what, decimated communities, absolutely decimated communities. And so now when you get to the late 90s, when California is now pushing back on medical, and then you fast forward to early 2013, 2014, and Colorado is now going legal for recreational. It's folks like me who got wind of all of this in 2015 and was like, wait a minute, hold on a second, we can't just skip ahead and start making this legal and forget about the people whose lives were destroyed because of this, the communities that were destroyed because of this. So that's really how I got into being an advocate, is just recognizing that this industry was built on the backs of people who, have been sitting in prisons, still sitting in prisons, people who have been ripped away from their families who couldn't feed themselves, couldn't afford affordable housing, couldn't get access to proper education, access to healthy foods, and all of these things are the effects of the war on drugs, and we cannot overlook that as we go through this period of legalization. So I hope that gives you a little bit of that history you were looking for.
And I definitely would love to piggyback off of that, because a lot of us are very familiar with, the impact nationwide, but this was really a global issue. And when I think about even the legacy of cannabis in Jamaica, many people would think that, Jamaica is the place where you can freely consume. But my father, when he wrote the song, legalized it in 1976, it was banned on the radio in Jamaica. And not only was it banned, the experience of, followers of Rastafari, people, how we have held that plant to be a sacrament, because of its references in the Bible. They were targeted often. Rastafarians would have their dreadlocks cut off. My father dealt with being targeted by the police because of his stance on legalization and his the way he kind of walked the walk, as a cannabis consumer. And that was a global shift. Cannabis has often been used as a means for police to violate the human rights and civil rights of many. When we look at, cases like Eric Garner, where, people have been faced police brutality, countless cases. Police will often claim that, they smelled cannabis. They couldn't believe that this person, had cannabis on them, and justify the means to harm, those that are in our communities. And although the statistics are clear that, people of all walks of life consume cannabis, it's only been Black and brown families that have faced the harms. And it's not only, incarceration, it's also people that have lost their lives, to the war on drugs, due to, police often using that to target individuals and target families and homes.
Absolutely. I'll go ahead and piggyback on everything everyone's been saying. It's extremely poignant. I mean, this war on drugs, it was a war on people, to be exactly frank. It's a war on Black and brown people. It's always been a very systematic racism-based war, 100% racism, 0% science. Like Frederika was saying, even when you look at who runs the world today, Big Pharma runs the world today, which is why a lot of the things have evolved in this manner when it comes to the war on drugs. Me personally, being from the South, I have seen a lot of these in the lens of slavery, coming from a place where people were enslaved, and you can still see the effects of that everywhere in America today. When the South did have its resurrection, when a lot of Black people did get power and were put into political positions, they were killed. And it has been an evolution of that history for us to continue to try and get power and get some sort of reparations in a country where we built the majority of it, and it can be traced back to plenty of banks that see us bought and sold. And then you put that into today, where we have successfully regulated cannabis in a lot of states, and what we have done is more successful than what criminalization has done for the impact and the harm for Black and brown people. So where we had small businesses in California, or we had minority businesses and some participation aspects, our over-regulation now is putting all of that out of business. And now cannabis is just for the privilege, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. But when you see the history of this drug, it's 100% a history of, there's 40,000 people still in jail. The way I look at it, it's modern slavery. If you wanted to take mass incarceration and then create workforce labor to then have an economic stimulus in your country similar to slavery, how could you do that? By looking at a plant like cannabis and saying, let's demonize this plant, let's demonize the people that use it, let's demonize the culture around it. And no matter the science, what we know in this country is the stigma is going to dictate everything, and the government dictates the stigma. So me growing up in Tennessee, I remember being in Dare as a child thinking cannabis was just as bad as heroin or meth or any other drug, because that's what was taught to me. And it's a miracle just being able to have, evolved. A lot of people will never evolve until the law changes, and then the stigma has to change. But it's really sad just to see that although we've come far, a lot of the things that have happened, especially with the overregulation that's happening in compliant cannabis, is grinding to a halt. Some things that were once a representation of us is now a representation of the 1%.
Juliana, if I can just quickly speak to something that Niambe, right? Did I say it right? Okay, perfect. But the fact of it being a global issue, so happy that you brought that up. And I just want to kind of bring it present day because, the U.S. used its power, its resources, and its influence to, basically, if we're looking at a carrot stick approach, really forcing other countries, other nations to adopt its false-based policies around cannabis use, right? And so we saw this last year with Sha'Carri Richardson, and how even though she ran, met the goal that she needs to meet in terms of being able to be included in the Olympics to represent her country. But she tested positive, right? And we know she tested positive after a reporter told her, leaked information to her about the passing of her mother, right? And so bringing that present, we have a situation where a young lady by the name of Camilla also tested positive, not for cannabis, but for an actual substance, a drug. I'm going to say drug because cannabis is a plant. So actually tested positive for the use of a drug that can help with your stamina, right? That can actually help with your performance. And she tested positive. She's with the Russian figure skating team, but she tested positive, 15-year-old young lady, and they're going to allow her to, they decided to allow her to still compete. And if she does win, then they'll decide how they're going to do the award ceremony. But I bring that up because, we're talking about the intentionality. We're talking about the racism that was attached to it, that is attached to this war that is continuing to be waged on Black people, on Latinx people, on Indigenous people. And so here we are yet with another example of how the U.S. have influenced those decisions and results of on a global space.
Thank you for sharing that. I was just thinking as you were all speaking to the history and it being really a war on people, to think about what those individual experiences look like, to understand what that really means, like how that really hits families and in the long term. And as you touched on earlier, what that trauma really looks like. And I would love to understand more about kind of the two things in order to lead up to where we're at now, or I guess one specific thing in order to lead up to where we're at now, which is on a kind of community level, that trauma that's been faced that now it seems is actually really being overlooked, as we're just like, okay, let's just make this corporate. We're all good. Isn't this fun? How fun? What is that trauma and that community trauma that's lasting and that, is people are clearly still kind of struggling to deal with and to overcome, and now is in a way people are kind of trying to steamroll it and make it seem like it didn't happen and it wasn't a big deal. But what is that lasting effect?
Go ahead, Nam.
Okay, I definitely would like to, share my family story. My father definitely, first faced persecution a generation before me. But in 2013, my brother, Jawara, was arrested for cannabis possession and in New Jersey. And honestly, because my family has never been involved with the cannabis industry, the cannabis, never been involved with the criminal justice industry, we really thought that this would be something that we would put behind us. And for 3 months, he was locked up in New Jersey in Bergen County Jail without a hearing. And it wasn't until 3 months later that we finally, as a family, went to the court to really hear what we were dealing with, and supporting him with my mom. And that's when we found out he was facing 20-year sentence. And the judge set the bail at $200,000. And so after another 3 months, my brother made bail. And for about 3 years, he went back and forth to New Jersey to be told, that, this is the best offer that you're going to get. You need to accept this offer. And we were torn as a family to fight for what we believed in as, our right and our human right to consume cannabis, but also knowing that New Jersey has some of the highest mass incarceration rates in the country. And, we eventually got the plea down to 5 years, and being told by, the lawyers around him that, you'll probably end up only serving a year. So you probably should just take the plea. And in December of 2016, he decided to accept the plea. In January of 2017, he turned himself into Bergen County Jail. And a month after being incarcerated, he was attacked by another inmate, and suffered a traumatic brain injury. And my family, my mom and I, immediately flew to New Jersey to be by his side. At first, and I think when you talk about the trauma, we were told that we couldn't even visit my brother. We were told that my brother, who has never been involved in the criminal justice system, a follower of Rastafari, a father of four, a musician, and an activist, that he didn't have the right, we didn't have the right to see him. And, it was really through my father's name that I think that the jail allowed us to be by his side. And when we got into the surgical ICU, my brother had half of his dreadlocks shaved. He was connected to, an oxygen machine. He had tubes down his throat, and he had a handcuff on his ankle, and he was surrounded by correctional officers. And, he was treated like an animal. And so when we think about trauma, all of this is a part of that. And I have those memories to this day. And unfortunately, my brother has passed away in 2020 due to his injuries. And so trauma is very, very deep rooted for families. The experience that we have with our criminal justice system as individuals, as families. My brother has 4 children. They don't have a father for the rest of their lives. And I think that it's important that, a story like mine is shared, because, we can say the word trauma, but there's so many stories that aren't shared. I'm blessed to have the platform that I do, but so many others do not. And it's important that as this industry evolves, we really think holistically about how we're going to support those that have been impacted by the war on drugs, because it's bigger than just, legalization. It's bigger than just making sure the selected few have an opportunity to be in the industry, but it's really about supporting communities holistically. We got to think about, therapy that comes into the industry, and how we allocate funds for all people, all ages, because this is generational. It's not just something that, one person has been affected by. It's families and it's entire communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So this, in seeing that this historically has literally ripped families apart, And I mean, people, so many people experience what that means, and no one seems to be kind of really understanding the gravity of what it means that happened on a mass scale to a select group of people. When you create the fracture in the family, when you create the lack of a father, a caretaker, of a mother, what that means long term.
An income source. I mean, because in
Income,
reality
yeah.
nowadays, to have a household on a single income is, I mean,
Unheard.
right? It's that next to
Yeah.
impossible, right? So, imagine, all of that has been like. I'll give another story as well that kind of gives, the flip side of it. So, we talk about how it's ripped people's families apart, but let's talk about the stress of trying to keep a family together, right? The very first time I spoke out as an advocate was back in 2015, and it was when my city was hearing a decriminalization ordinance, and I spoke up and I told a story about a young man who, prior to getting into cannabis, I was in education. I worked at University of Central Florida, University of Miami before then, working with underprivileged kids, minority kids, helping them to get through into college and through college. And one of my students, I remember, he came through my program, which was called the Upward Bound program. Hope underprivileged kids get into college. We work with them in tutoring and college applications, the whole nine. And he ended up getting kicked out of the program because on one occasion he was caught with a joint, and so that began to spiral and turn into something completely different. He ended up still getting into a community college, got into community college, went out on the weekend, got arrested for what? Having a joint. So now this has become a strike two, if you will, for his life. So now he can't get financial aid. So he can no longer continue the track of going to college because, he's no longer eligible for financial aid since he has this charge on his record now. He doesn't have the financial means from family or otherwise to be able to pay for it. So now he's left to his own devices to try to figure out how do he feed himself. He has a family as well. A family of four. So he's forced into either going back into, or going into a life of crime because that wasn't his life before. So someone who's never been in a criminal lifestyle now choosing that as a potential option. He, can potentially go get a job, a 9-to-5 job that pays him, little to no salary. It doesn't pay a livable wage. And so we end up in these cycles. And again, that stress, it may not be trauma, but that stress is what a lot of people are just living with on a day-to-day basis. And again, not only can this plant help from a medicinal standpoint, but imagine if we were able to give that young man an opportunity as a professional or even a business in this space. And so now when the rest of the world and society has told him no time and time again, he has a real path forward, a path to social mobility, which is one of the things, bread and butter of this country, of what we say we believe in, is providing that opportunity. So.
Thank you.
But Erik, I would definitely say it is trauma, right? I would say it's trauma because anytime you see one group of people or a group of people being able to do something and being treated differently than you, then that's trauma, right? So if you are, in areas and spaces where, look, the reality is that we know that white folks consume cannabis, if not equally to, but actually more than people of color, right? Like we know that, but they are not arrested, they are not sentenced, they're not treated in the same way. And so that is very traumatic, right? To go through life knowing that it is different for you, that you are living under a different set of rules, right? To be a mother and listen to a podcast where some women are openly talking about, and women who may not be of color are talking about how consuming cannabis makes them a better parent. But if you just have the sense of it on you, then you have CPS knocking at your door. So all of that is very traumatic. And with the sentencing, with the disparate treatment, then you have, as you were mentioning, the second class tier of a felony charge, right? And so we know how that impacts your school, your housing, your job opportunities, all of those things. So I would definitely say that all of it is very traumatic.
this is like blowing my mind a little bit. So this means historically, this plant has been used not only it's ripped apart families, it's taken that away, it's taken lives away because these people have been locked away. It's also taken away privilege. If a joint that now we could buy for $10 can stand in the way of a college opportunity, that is insane. And now to be moving forward, for that to not be the forefront for the conversation, is like what's really like, oh my gosh, this is nuts, is that the push is, okay, let's make this, a business. And the media is, oh, it's made to look glamorous. Oh, we're building brands. This is what we're all focused on. Oh, the plant. We're making the plant good again. We're making the plant accepted. But it's like you're saying, it wasn't about that. It was about the people. Moving forward, it seems that that's what should be focused on. Oh, we're going to lift this pressure, this stress, this long-term threat on these communities. And I don't know that that's been really being done appropriately. So can you each shed light on, is there anything that's being done well right now, or what is it that needs to be done like far better than the kind of efforts? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love this question because I feel like in a lot of ways we are still in the same place that we've been in. There's definitely some positive things that are happening in the equity building community, but look at New Jersey. New Jersey just regulated and there's 0 Black-owned dispensaries. In Illinois, I think Illinois has 1 Black-owned dispensary, and it's a friend of mine who used to be an attorney for Green Thumb Industries. These aren't, normal people that are getting these licenses coast to coast right now. So I think that even for me, a story that ties into the last question and into now, my brother and I have both been selling cannabis in the traditional market since 2006, 2007 in Tennessee. So we were in a highly criminalized place doing something highly illegal, and they would love to find us, love to lock us up, love to give us a conviction and a fine, just like every other minority in Knoxville, Tennessee. My brother and I are very lucky that even though we did go through different things, we've both been arrested for cannabis, we got our charges expunged and now they're no longer on our record. Even talking about that, investors that I run across, they say, Marie, we heard you on a podcast saying that like you were arrested. You shouldn't say that, because even though your background check is clean, we might not be able to give you the same support and funding and look highly of that. Where in my eyes, compliant cannabis is one of the only places you see prior success as a potential hurdle in the future for you. So we're here, it's 2022, sitting here hearing Miss Tosh's story, where that was 2017 when her brother turned himself in. New Jersey just went legal. Like, there is such an amazingly large disconnect with the fact that we're still in modern day slavery right now. There's 40,000 people that are still in jail. The ones that they want to let out are the only ones that were non-violent or in a non-violent situation. If you have been selling cannabis as long as I have, you have been in plenty of violent situations. In California, I even joke now, it's more dangerous to sell compliant cannabis because of all the robberies and break-ins than traditional cannabis all this time. So there's this like a very highly elevated factor of all of these different things are happening. Meanwhile, only the rich are being able to participate. Only the rich are getting richer. We have equity programs, but they're unfunded. They're essentially like unsustainable in every way because they do not have any stability when it comes to giving those impacted by the war on drugs funding. If you were impacted by the war on drugs, that means that you have to have, you lived in a certain police beat, you make under a certain amount of money nearly in every jurisdiction, but there's not unbiased funding for you. So where do you go? What do you do? I mean, there's definitely successes in equity programs, and we can definitely get into them. But from my standpoint as like an operator in this California regulated market, there needs to be far more changes to impact small business, Black business, minority business, Indigenous business. We're almost unable to compete in the industry we created. It's a bit of a sham at this point. Even when you think of watch South Park episode the other day where the white guy says, I mean, we went and we're using their culture and we recreated their culture and now they went and started their own business. This is ridiculous. It's sad, but it's true how not only whitewashed, but how when we want to participate in our own industry, and this is something Miss Angela White says all the time from the nonprofit that I work with, but they treat us like a handout. Like equity is a handout. Like they're giving us something for participating in the industry that we created on our backs that we are still in jail for today.
Oh, wow.
I think that was very, very well said. I have definitely taken, I guess here's what I say. I think social equity programs, when I got into the industry back in 2015, when I walked into my state legislator in 2017, just after we had passed our ballot initiative, the word diversity wasn't even a part of the conversation. People had missed even the term diversity in conversations. So social equity wasn't even a thought at the time in my state. To see now across the country where we're having these conversations about social equity, where they're being considered early on in the policy process versus later, I think is movement, and that's progress. However, what we have seen is that even when we have gotten it, quote unquote, right from a policy standpoint, and is well intentioned, well thought out, it always is lacking something when it comes to the implementation of these programs. And I think Marie hit on one of the key factors, obviously being the lack of funding, capitalization for these businesses. I think we also have to consider what type of person are we giving a license to if they have been incarcerated, they've had difficulty re-engaging or reintegrating back into society, meaning they've had trouble getting jobs, getting training, getting additional skills and resources. So perhaps they don't even have the business acumen to be able to run a business. So we have to provide for that, right? So it's not just the funding; it's also the business acumen and the overall support. But the last thing I'll say is this: we as an industry are failing when it comes to social equity because we're missing the ball. Right now, as an industry, all we focus on is giving licenses, meaning giving you the ability to go start a business if you have been arrested or incarcerated for cannabis, come from one of the communities that have been over policed, and so on and so on. But we're missing the pervasiveness of what the war on drugs was. What about how that impacted housing? What about how it impacted getting tax revenue dollars from a city to be put into a community to rebuild the streets and the roads so that kids have a safe, route to school. These things go far beyond licensing. This goes into earmarking the tax dollars that come from this industry to, again, repair and restore the harms that were caused by the war on drugs. We also have to look at how do we not, and again, we are not going to start enough businesses as Black people and minority people, Latinx people, Indigenous people. We're not going to start enough businesses in order to make the cannabis industry diverse. It's not going to happen. That means we also have to be looking at these large, multi-state operators. We have to look at white-owned companies, small businesses, and so on. How are we as an industry addressing diversity as a whole? How are we addressing and making sure that any company that is in cannabis has some social equity give back, recognizing that if they're going to exist in this industry, that they have an obligation to restore the right and right the wrongs of prohibition. That's just a fact. But we are focused so heavily on the licensing that we've lacked the creativity and the real substantive conversations around all of the other things that we could be doing.
Yeah, I definitely want to add on to that is And it's also important that we continue to modify regulations and adjust. As Erik said, we're so focused on, licenses to run, to own dispensaries and to own grows, but we have to also look at, the co-op model. We also look at, small micro licenses, opportunities where no matter where you are, you have the means to enter into the market, to make it a more diverse market. We don't just have to be, it shouldn't just be that you have to go to a dispensary. If I have, a friend that has a small grow at home, I want to be able to support, my friend in that way. Or maybe it's a community of farmers or Black owned farmers, and they have a co-op model where they're able to pool their resources in. I don't see too many co-op models that are successful within the regulations. Massachusetts has the regulations in there, but it's been a slow crawl to see co-ops become successful. So I think that we definitely have to continue to rewrite and modify regulations as we see the social equity part not being fulfilled. And it shouldn't just be set in stone. And obviously with policy comes politics. And so we've seen that, play out time and time again, and these cities and host agreements and everything that comes with that. And so I think that as we see the failures, we have to continue to modify regulations so that there is a continued effort to make sure that we have diversity. I want to believe that there's going to be diversity. Maybe everyone's not going to be, the multi-million-dollar dispensary, but I would like to see, the legendary market have a means to laterally move across into the regulated market. And I think that's possible. It's just going to take, a lot more work on our part.
Yeah, and if I can add to it, everyone here has made amazing points. And just my mind is all over the place. But like the first thing I want to say is, like, let's for a minute just kind of ground ourselves in why we're regulating, right? We are regulating cannabis because legacy operators showed us just how profitable this industry is. Through asset forfeitures, which we know were expanded during the war on drugs to include homes, boats, jewelry, clothing, all of those things, intentionally, once again, expanded during cannabis prohibition, right? But all of those things showed us just how profitable this industry is. And so we saw during the pandemic, even an uptick of states that, chose to regulate, and primarily because, their funding was decimated, due to the pandemic. And so they needed that influx of cash. They needed that tax revenue. And so when we're talking about the funding of social equity programs, a number of you all mentioned this, but they're always trying to fund these programs with tax revenue, right? With the revenue from sales, which means that the money is not available day one. It's not available for people who need assistance, equity operators or future equity operators who need assistance with the crazy licensing fees, with the attorney fees of even just dealing with the application process, right? And so no one really wants to talk about, reappropriating the funds that were given to police departments, that were given to justice departments to disparately impact Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, right? So like, where's that money? Why can that money not be made available on the front end, specifically for harm repair for individuals as well as communities? The other thing I think is in terms of equity programs, my CEO, Christine De La Rosa, we successfully transitioned out of the legacy market again. And what she says in terms of social equity programs is that it's basically the Hunger Games. And may the odds be in your favor, because you have a number of BIPOC people who are all fighting for this piece of the pie, this small piece of the pie, while everyone else is enjoying 85% of it. There's just this 15%, this little slice that BIPOC people are fighting for, right? And so we're fighting for basically exploiting our trauma, because if you look at the criteria and you look at what you need to have gone through in order to be an equity operator, in order to take advantage of social equity programs, it is all the things. I think, Marie, you laid out the criteria, but it's all those things, right? Were you arrested, or someone in your family arrested or charged for a cannabis crime? Are you below the poverty level in terms of your income? These are all of the things that you need to fit into, right, in order to even have access to some of these social equity programs. And then I think the other thing is that just the existence of a program is not enough. There are a lot of places or a lot of states who have equity programs, but they're really not doing anything with it. And we're also not looking at the difference between people becoming licensed versus actually operational. And so we're seeing that in a number of places where, maybe 153 licenses were awarded, but how many of those people were actually able to use that license? How many people actually have operational businesses?
What's interesting about what you're all saying too is that why is it just here, we'll give you some licenses, you take care of whatever harm's been done. Like, what? I love that. Why isn't the funding going to, why is it we're just like, oh, okay, sure, education, but not reparation of harm that's been done? Why is it, here's a little bit of licenses, if you could all try and figure out how to run successful businesses, and if you could take care of this, that'd be great. That's crazy. That's like crazy. And one thing that I've noticed that I would love your, I don't think a lot of people see, and I would love your input on. I've tried to say this from the start, but when I'm working with these investors, it like drives me crazy how many of them will try to publicize their efforts. And sometimes I'm like, are you kidding me? You're throwing together your diversity plans. The stats you're saying about your diversity in your companies, not impressive. That's not an impressive percentage. And then they're doing things like, oh, we bought this land that used to be used for this, and now we're using it for, aren't we great? Aren't we really? I'm like, it feels gross in a way. What's your insight, like, on the, all the people that these companies really, that these licenses and the businesses that are being grown, like, even their participation in pretending to be helping the issue? I mean, what's your insight on that? Because I was like, this is not okay. Like, if once more people see what's happening, like, this is weird. It feels weird. Like, I don't know.
It's tokenism. Like, one is not enough. Let's just, and like, I would love to hear other people's thoughts. But one is not enough. I'm so tired of seeing it myself. Yes. Okay. If there's one successful operator, that's awesome. But what about the thousands or hundreds of others, right? Like, we cannot get into or stay in this place where we allow ourselves to be diverted from like what the real goal is, and what the real problems are, right? And so, we have to kind of do away with that whole tokenism. We have to kind of do away with a lack of overall accountability. Just having a program is not enough. What are you doing with the program? Anytime I'm looking up research, it's so difficult to find. Like, I can find the percentage of ownership, but I can't find, specifically for cannabis, funding, right? Like, how much VC or how much funding are specifically like BIPOC people being able to acquire or to, gain in cannabis. I can't find, okay, well, these people got their license, but, were they actually able to become operational, and like, what's going on with that? And is it just a year, or what happens between those 3 years? Because we know the first 3 years of any business is really difficult. And oftentimes, you are just trying to stay afloat. It's really that third year where you may start to see some kind of profit. But we know that that is exacerbated for cannabis because we have 280E, right, where you can't even claim all of your business expenses on your taxes. So, I mean, just the barriers are just like astronomical, and especially for people of color, like we have additional ones as well. So that's what I'll say on that.
I think one thing that I see out here in California is how accepted the corruption is at this point. When it comes to equity deals and equity contracts, I mean, you can be, I'll just say these large MSOs, some California based, some outside based, but once they see that you're supposed to have 51% of this license, they're going to do a back end deal with you. They're going to tell you other equity people will take a different deal. Even though it's written right there, you're supposed to have a certain percentage, they will backdoor you before they even open the front door for you. The equity program in San Francisco specifically, we have priority processing. That is it. We don't have anything else. There is a grant program. It was a bit of a reverse grant, meaning you had to spend the money first in order to get the money. It was a reimbursement. It was not a grant. So you're supposed to be poor and have all these different traumas that you've been through in life, literally. And then you have to go spend 100 grand to get 100 grand back, or spend 40 grand to get 40 grand back. The MSOs that are so far ahead of equity, and this talks to Frederika's point a little, but first it's medical. In every state, you see medical go first. Usually that's not any people of color. Then you see equity programs and recreational come next, but it's medical goes to rec gets open, rec then funds equity, and it's all a downhill slope because the money was never there, and the money's coming from people that are getting a head start before equity. Even like in San Francisco, we have about 4 equity operating stores open, and we only have one sole proprietor, one person that was able to do this without a large corporation or multi-state operator that had to back them and backdoor them. And there's so much corruption, especially in California, and I can speak to that just because that's where I sit, that in these operating agreements that they create with their equity partner, it will explicitly say you cannot be an owner. And there will be an MSO that relists themselves as an owner in somebody else's name in their equity agreement and does it again and does it again. And their attorney will go back and say, this is illegal. You literally can't do this. But this MSO doesn't care. They do not care. They would rather be fined. They would rather run with the ball. I mean, this is America, right? Like most corporations would rather be fined for doing the wrong thing than doing the right thing. And ironically, cannabis is happening so fast. Like our transition from going from criminalization to ending prohibition to regulation is happening so fast that most minorities have no chance. You can look out the window and you can see, why aren't any minorities living in the richest areas? Why aren't the schools catering towards minority? In Oakland last week, we just had 5, I know at least 3 Black schools closed. They cannot fund the Black schools in Oakland right now. We have so many high-level issues that are surrounding not only cannabis, but just looking out the window at any and every industry. When you look at agriculture or construction or anything that we need to touch the supply chain, they don't let us touch the supply chain. And it's no secret. So we really have to look at all of the ways that we're writing this legislation and the powers that be, because right now, expecting the people that have the power to give us any of that power or fund any of this to then take power from them, when at this point they've already monopolized cannabis, is a bit of an oxymoron. Like anything that we get, and I say this all the time, is it will be by force, and forcing the politicians to give us what's rightfully ours, which is sad but true right now. And then just to add to that, the diversity talk, there will be no diversity until they incentivize diversity. You get what you incentivize. You get what you incentivize in every area of this country and government and politics. Whatever we incentivize businesses to do is what we get. And we have no diversity attached to incentive. A company doesn't get a tax break. A company doesn't get any money in their pocket from adding diversity in their mind on their balance sheet. But if we incentivize that, then we would see results from that. But right now, we are not incentivizing diversity in cannabis the right way, if you ask me.
Frederika, I know you have to leave. If you can just say something real quick before you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I got to jump to another situation, but Thank you so much, Bluntness, for having me. I guess last words I'll end with is look, the success and the sustainability of the regulated market depends on the successful, I would say to Marie's point, the incentivized, and the respectful transition of legacy operators. There's always going to be a legacy market. Please stop trying to create legislation and regulation for the extremes, for the outliers. We still have people bootlegging moonshine, right? So there's always going to be an underground, there's always going to be a legacy market. But let's make sure that we are being respectful, that we are honoring and acknowledging the fact that these legacy operators have run, some of them for decades, successful businesses where they have loyal clients, they have a loyal following. And if we want the regulated market to grow and to be sustainable, then we need to bring them over. And I'll say that. Thank you. The People's Ecosystem is very excited about this opportunity. Thank you for having me, and everyone be blessed and blunt.
Thank you. Bye. Okay. On this, Erik, Niambe, I feel like I haven't heard from you in a while. Do you have anything on this? Yeah, these feigned efforts that have occurred so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think even that has evolved, right? I think we saw efforts at different stages, right? I think social equity is a part of that evolution. We saw after George Floyd, the black squares on Twitter, the LinkedIn, messages in solidarity. We've seen that, and I think we're now moving into this new era where multi-state operators are recognizing that it is going to be extremely difficult for them to operate in this cannabis industry if they don't themselves have some type of social equity, give back some type of social equity fabric to who they are as an organization. And so as a result, we've seen multi-state operators begin to hire, DEI professionals, begin to hire HR professionals and other minorities in C-suite roles and so on. But then the ball is dropped once again because the action is lacking in intention, or the intentions are not aligned with, where we should be aligning them in terms of our goals. Many times these African-American male and women, and I talk to a lot of them, are in these, well-capitalized, multi-state operating companies that have no clue what to do with them, have no clue how to allow them to utilize their skill sets and professionalism that they've gained, through their career in this role in the cannabis industry. For those companies, the thought of, we have hired them, we're great, we're good. Look, we hired a DEI professional, but then you bring them in and they can't make decisions on their own at the departmental level. They're not given a budget. They're not given autonomy to be able to impact the fabric of the company or in the communities that they exist in. And so just sit there, or they end up, being frustrated, or they end up dealing with the same microaggressions that they've dealt with in other corporate settings. So, we see a lot of it. And I think it has a lot to do, like I said before, with just lack of intentionality and aligning our, our goals with, this idea, really and truly. And I really don't know how anybody could really disagree with this. If you are operating in the cannabis industry, you have an obligation to help repair the harms of the war on drugs, just as much as the government does, just as much as, the police department and our justice system, just as much as, if you are in this industry, you have a business in this space, it is in part your responsibility to help repair the harm of what prohibition in the war on drugs did. And I think once we start to align our goals with that mindset and that thinking, then we'll truly see impact. We'll see not just one hire at the C-suite level or a managerial level, but multiple. And we'll see the culture and the fabric of companies begin to change and respond to that. And I'm not, forever optimist. So I know I speak in a little bit of a rosy colored picture that I'm giving folks, but I do so very deliberately in hopes that, again, like I said at the earlier start of this conversation, we as an industry have a great opportunity to become the most diverse industry across this country, across the globe, if we are willing to recognize what it's going to take to make that happen.
And just to add on to that, the reality is that studies have shown that diversity does help your bottom line, and so it's a matter of not only doing the right thing because it's the right thing, but when you have diverse perspectives and not just a monolithic message being forced on everyone, you're able to reach a lot more people and uplift us as a society. Like, America has to get it together. We know our history. We know our legacy. It's no secret anymore. And as Erik said, after George Floyd, a lot of people have definitely been made aware of the plight of Black and brown people in this country, and there has been a shift where a lot of people are shifting to try to do the right thing, but it's not just checking a box and hiring someone, and it's making sure that when we do have these professionals in the diversity and inclusion roles, that they are given the respect to shift the culture, or the predominant culture that exists in a lot of these multi-million-dollar companies. And I do believe that we can slowly shift towards justice. I think that it's gonna take time. We've definitely made a lot of progress, just in general, with legalization. That's still something I want to make sure that, on one hand, we kind of live in this dichotomy where we continue to celebrate every baby step that we make, because I know that at least in New Jersey, someone's not going to be arrested for cannabis. At least in some of these states, that's not going to be the issue. But we do have to also make sure that we aren't shifting that policing to the unregulated market. I've seen some preliminary regulations and talks of trying to have all this heavy force on the unregulated market as well, and that's not the way to go. The only way to do this right is to welcome those that have participated and made this legacy market possible, but also make sure that all of these MSOs that are operating are held accountable. And I think that they're starting to get a whiff of that accountability, because we are showing up on every platform to remind them what needs to be done. And, with a lot of the reports coming out, we can clearly see where funding is going and where and what diversity looks like in some of these establishments. So, I'm glad to be a part of this panel and to continue the conversation. And I think that it's important that, it doesn't stop here, but we continue to also make sure that as consumers, we continue to put our dollar with the companies that are doing the right thing.
I do have to jump really quick, but that last little piece you just said, Niambe, it reminded me. I mentioned how government has a role, the companies and operators, the advocates have a role, but so do you all as consumers. We live in an age now where we put our money speaks, it sends a message. And so I'm challenging you all as consumers to be more discerning about where you're getting your products from and the companies you're spending your money with, I think is extremely important. So, but I really enjoyed this conversation. I thank you guys for holding it. I hope that, more of you will join the fight, help us continue to push this thing, forward. And just thank you to the Bluntness for, holding this, and to all of my lovely queens and sisters who were all here, adding to this conversation as well.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you. Okay, so I've just got the two of you left. We'll wrap this up. I was going to tie together to Marie, you said we've got to incentivize it. And Niambe, you said, which I try to tell people this also, there is research that in business, diversity pushes profits. There is an incentive to have more diverse teams, but none of these companies seem to want to know business any more than Excel spreadsheets, I guess. But that stuff does matter. That is a benefit. It isn't just something that's being fought for just to be fought for. It's like, this matters and this is valuable. It's valuable. It means something. So thank you for making those points. And with the two of you, I would love to just know ways people can get involved, because I think this was an inspiring conversation. I would be inspired to get more involved. So how do people do that if they would like to?
You can go first, Niambe.
Okay. Well, I think that, I made the point before, put your money with companies that align with your values. That's very, very important. And then support a lot of these nonprofits that are on the ground. Minorities for Medical Marijuana, the Peter Tosh Foundation, Last Prisoner Project, and that's just to name a few. But there's also a lot of organizations that are on the front lines for policy and making sure that policy is equitable and really doing the work for us. So just supporting those, and knowing that this industry not only takes, the concept of capitalism and coming into it to make money, but in order for a lot of Black and Brown companies to be successful, it's a level of advocacy and activism. And so, support those that are doing that in that light. And I don't know. I think it's also about changing the stigma. There still is a stigma attached to cannabis. Of course, you can go to different states or cities where that stigma isn't there, but a lot of the policymakers, unfortunately, have been kind of indoctrinated with the stigma. And so we need to see the regulations shift towards less regulated market versus a highly regulated market with a lot of fines and consequences, and shifting towards like welcoming people into the cannabis industry. And so we all got to show up as activists.
Absolutely. I would definitely piggyback everything that Niambe said, and just like local impact. Everything that I've seen that's happened usually comes from the bottom and bubbles up, right? It's very rare that the federal government gets something right, especially without hearing from all the grassroots activists and the people that are actually doing the work on the ground. So making sure, like, whoever that is in your community, coast to coast, globally, that you're getting with those people that can involve the most local impact and the most economic impact to the people that, we're all trying to help here. Success Centers is the nonprofit that I work with in San Francisco, and we have had hundreds of people come through our program that are all getting licensed in San Francisco. But we're now shifting, because I think one thing that we've talked about briefly is most people that were impacted by the war on drugs don't want to necessarily be in compliant cannabis. We need to make sure that we have other business avenues and initiatives for those that have been put down and, have come from these backgrounds of trauma and single parent homes, have other opportunities to exist, whether it's in the ecosystem around cannabis with an ancillary business, or even something else. Maybe they want to start a completely different business, and we need to make sure that we're having local government realize that and write rules and regulations for that. There's a group that I work with. It's a policy group. It's called the Working Group Life, and we wrote an advocacy workbook for jurisdictions that want to have equity programs, and it has a lot of metrics for success and unsuccessful programs. And I can send you that link to that document, that handbook. But that's a really good resource just for those looking to learn more about equity programs coast to coast and what they can do to incentivize having that in their community.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here and for contributing your time and your knowledge and your experience. Thank you both so much. I'm so appreciative.
It's a pleasure.
Definitely a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a great day. Nice meeting you.
Take care.
Take care.
Wow.